Environmental hazards. There are a variety of hazardous phenomena in our environment, from hurricanes to volcanoes to droughts. Climate-related hazards have always been with us, and some of these hazards will be made much worse by climate change. Climate models indicate that we'll face an increasing number of natural disasters. But those of us who study environmental hazards like to say that there's no such thing as a natural disaster. We're not saying that disasters don't occur or that all dangerous natural phenomena are created by human activity. Instead, what we mean when we say that there's no such thing as a natural disaster is that a disaster, that is, a severe impact on human well-being, is the result of a combination of the severity of the environmental hazard and the affected society's vulnerability. Vulnerability refers to a society's ability to deal with changes in its environment. Factors like poverty, mismanagement by political leaders, and social inequalities can make a society or certain subgroups within the society more vulnerable to a hazard, whereas other societies or other subgroups are less vulnerable to the same hazard. Nature alone can't cause a disaster. Consider two major earthquakes from back in 2010. In Haiti, the earthquake was a 7.0 on the moment magnitude scale, which is the updated scale that replaced the familiar Richter scale. In Chile, the earthquake was an 8.8 magnitude. Because the moment magnitude scale is logarithmic, the Chilean earthquake was almost 100 times stronger than the Haitian earthquake. But in Haiti, 230,000 people were killed, whereas in Chile, only 531 people died. The difference is that Haiti was more vulnerable. For example, buildings were not built up to a high standard, so they collapsed easily. The government lacked the money to get effective aid and first responders to affected areas. The causes of Haiti's vulnerability lie in the history of colonialism and the structure of the international economy, which we don't have the time to get into here, but they're all within the social realm. So a smaller natural hazard event turned into a bigger disaster when it encountered a high level of social vulnerability. We often talk about disasters as being risks. We don't know exactly when a hurricane or an earthquake will strike. The amount of risk presented by a hazard is a product of its probability and its severity. That is, it's a bigger risk if it's more likely to happen, or if it causes more harm when it does happen. From an accounting perspective, all you have to do is multiply. A 1% chance of losing $10 is the same in the long run as a 10% chance of losing $1. But in practice, people and societies consider a lot more factors than just probability times severity when deciding what hazards to worry about. For example, smaller but more frequent hazards might be easier for society to cope with and rebuild from. There's a whole field of risk perception in psychology, sociology, and geography that is dedicated to understanding why people care about some hazards and not others. If a disaster is a combination of the hazard and our vulnerability, then there are two approaches to preventing a disaster. If we focus on reducing the hazard event, we call that mitigation. This might involve reducing the probability of the hazard, reducing its severity, or both. In the context of climate change, mitigation means reducing the amount and speed of climate change. This, in turn, means reducing the net anthropogenic forcings in our climate system. On the other hand, if we aim at reducing our vulnerability, we call that adaptation. Kind of like an organism adapting to its environment, we can alter our society so that it's less harmed by the climate change that does occur. A resilient society is one that is able to recover easily from hazard events. There's a lot of research being done on how to make a society more resilient. A government that is democratically accountable to its citizens, social trust among people in society, a diversified economy, and good communication of valid information are all things that help increase a society's resilience. A response to climate change will involve some combination of mitigation and adaptation. Even if we stopped all greenhouse gas emissions tomorrow, we would still see continued warming due to the emissions that are already in the atmosphere, so we're going to need to adapt it to at least some of these changes. At the same time, adaptation gets harder and harder the more our climate warms, so some amount of mitigation is also necessary. How to balance mitigation and adaptation is a complicated ethical and political question. Any policy we adopt is going to have some winners and some losers. If you choose to advocate for or against a certain policy measure, think carefully about who bears the costs and who reaps the benefits.